Hello everybody, this is Mike History 2 and welcome to Leon Trotsky versus Joseph Stalin Part 3. So, when Lenin died in January 1924, Stalin took charge of the funeral and the Politburo embalmed his corpse and placed it within a mausoleum in Moscow's Red Square. That year, Petrograd was renamed Leningrad. At the following 13th Party Congress, Lenin's testament was read out to important Bolsheviks. Embarrassed by its contents, Stalin offered his resignation as general secretary, but this act of humility saved him and he retained the position. His wife had given birth to a daughter, Svetlana, in February 1926. After Lenin's death, several people emerged in the struggle to become his successor. Alongside Stalin was Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, Alexei Rykov, and Mikhail Tomsky. Stalin saw Trotsky, whom he personally hated, as the main obstacle to his rise to dominance within the Communist Party, and while Lenin had been ill, he'd forged an anti-Trotsky alliance with Kamenev and Zinoviev. Although Zinoviev was worried about Stalin's growing authority, he supported him at the 13th Congress to oppose Trotsky, who now led a party faction known as the Left Opposition. The Left Opposition believed that too many concessions to capitalism had been made with the new economic policy. Stalin built up a retinue of his supporters in the Central Committee, while the Left Opposition were gradually removed from their positions of influence. He was supported in this by Bukharin, who, like Stalin, believed that implementing the Left Opposition's proposal would plunge the Soviet Union into instability. In late 1924, Stalin also removed Kamenev and Zinoviev's supporters from key positions. In 1925, Kamenev and Zinoviev moved into open opposition of Stalin and Bukharin. They attacked one another at the 14th Party Congress, where Stalin accused Kamenev and Zinoviev of reintroducing division and therefore instability into the party. In 1926, Kamenev and Zinoviev joined with Trotsky supporters to form the United Opposition against Stalin. Stalin threatened to resign in both December 1926 and December 1927. In October 1927, Zinoviev and Trotsky were removed from the Central Committee. Zinoviev was exiled to Kazakhstan and later deported in 1929. Some of the United Opposition members who changed their minds were later allowed to return to government. Stalin had established himself as the party's supreme leader, although was not the head of government, a task he entrusted to his important ally Vyacheslav Molotov. In 1924, Georgians seeking independence launched the August Uprising, but it was suppressed by the Red Army, once again Stalin being very loyal to his people. In April 1925, Tsaritsyn was renamed Stalingrad. In 1926, Stalin published On Questions of Leninism. It was in this book that he introduced the concept of socialism in one country, which he claimed was a Leninist perspective, but it clashed with established Bolshevik views that socialism could not be established in one country, but could only be achieved globally through the process of world revolution. Now, in 1927, there was some argument in the party over the Soviet Union's policy towards China. Stalin wanted the Communist Party of China, led by Mao Zedong, to ally itself with Chiang Kai-shek or Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang's nationalists, viewing a communist Kuomintang alliance as the best defense against Japanese imperial expansionism in Eastern Asia. Instead, the Kuomintang persecuted the communists and a civil war broke out. By the end of the 1920s, the Soviet Union was behind the industrial development of Western countries, and Stalin's government feared military attack from Japan, the United Kingdom, and for some reason France, even though who's scared of France? Now, many communists were eager to get rid of the new economic policy, desiring to push towards socialism. These communists were worried about a growing sector of society, well-to-do peasants known as kulaks and the small business owners. There had also been less grain supplies, and in 1927 there was only 70% of the grain produced in 1926. At this point, Stalin turned against the new economic policy. In early 1928, Stalin traveled to Novosibirsk, there claiming that kulaks were hoarding their grain. He ordered that kulaks be arrested and the grain confiscated, with Stalin bringing much of the area's grain back to Moscow with him in February. At his command, grain-taking squads appeared across western Siberia and the Urals, with violence breaking out between these squads and the peasants. Stalin announced that kulaks had to be forced into releasing their harvest. In January 1930, the Politburo approved Stalin's decision to eliminate the kulaks, and kulaks were rounded up and exiled to concentration camps. Many died during the journey. In 1929, the Politburo announced a mass collectivization of agriculture, establishing both collective farms and state farms. Although officially voluntary, many peasants joined the collectives out of fear that they would face the fate of the kulaks. Others joined amid intimidation and violence from party loyalists. By 1932, about 62% of peasants were part of collectives, and by 1936, this had risen to 90%. Many of the peasants who had been collectivized resented the loss of their private farms, and productivity slowed down. Famine broke out in many areas. Armed peasant uprisings against dekulakization and collectivization broke out in Ukraine, the Northern Caucasus, Southern Russia, and Central Asia, reaching their peak in 1930 but they were crushed by the Red Army. In 1928, the first five-year plan was launched. Its main focus was on boosting heavy industry. It was finished a year ahead of schedule in 1932. The Soviet Union underwent a massive economic transformation. New mines were opened, new cities were constructed, and work on the White Sea-Baltic Canal began. Millions of peasants moved to the cities and became workers, although there weren't enough houses. Many of the major construction projects, including the White Sea-Baltic Canal and the Moscow Metro, were constructed largely through forced labor. The last elements of workers' control over industry were removed, with factory managers increasing their authority and receiving privileges and perks. To promote the intensification of labor, a series of medals and awards, as well as the Stakhanovite movement, were introduced. Stalin's message was that socialism was being established in the Soviet Union, while capitalism was crumbling amid the Wall Street crash. The first major show trial in the Soviet Union was the Shakti Trial of 1928, in which several industrial specialists were convicted of sabotage. From 1929 to 1930, further show trials were held to intimidate opposition. Aware that the ethnic Russian majority may have concerns about being ruled by a Georgian, he promoted Russians throughout the state hierarchy and made Russian mandatory throughout schools and offices. National sentiment among minorities was suppressed. Conservative social policies were promoted to enhance social discipline and boost population growth. It included a focus on strong family units and motherhood and restrictions placed on abortion and divorce. Stalin desired a cultural revolution, so he oversaw the construction of schools, newspapers, and libraries, as well as the advancement of literacy and numeracy. Wait, that means Stalin was a good guy the whole time. Man, should have known. Socialist realism was promoted throughout the arts. He also expressed patronage for scientists whose research fitted within his interpretation of Marxism. The government's anti-religious campaign was re-intensified with increased funding given to the League of Militant Atheists, and Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and Buddhist clergy faced persecution. Many religious buildings were demolished, most notably Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior, destroyed in 1931 to make way for the Palace of the Soviets. However, in the 1937 census, 57% of people were still religious. Throughout the 1920s and beyond, Stalin placed a high priority on foreign policy. Throughout the Communist International, Stalin's government exerted a strong influence over communist parties around the world. At his 6th Congress in July 1928, Stalin informed delegates that the main threat to socialism came not from the right but from non-communist socialists and social democrats, whom he called social fascists, because he realized in many countries, social democrats were the communists' main rivals for worker support. Stalin faced problems in his family life. In 1929, his son Yakov unsuccessfully attempted suicide. His relationship with Nadia was also strained because of their arguments and her mental health problems. November 1932, after a group dinner in the Kremlin in which Stalin flirted with other women, Nadia shot herself. He underwent a significant change following the suicide, becoming emotionally harder, as if he wasn't hard enough anyways. Within the Soviet Union, there was widespread hatred towards Stalin's government. I wonder why. Now, social unrest, previously restricted largely to the countryside, was increasingly evident in cities, prompting Stalin to ease on some of his economic policies in 1932. In May 1932, introduced a system of markets where peasants could trade their export products. The second five-year plan had its production quotas reduced from that of the first, the main emphasis now being on improving living conditions. Now, it therefore emphasized the expansion of housing space and the production of consumer goods. Like its predecessor, the plan was repeatedly changed to meet changing situations. However, this didn't stop the Soviet famine of 1932 to 1933. Between 5.9 and 11.8 million people died, and many resorted to cannibalizing the dead to survive. The areas that were worst affected were Ukraine and Kazakhstan, although the famine also impacted a lot of other areas in the Southwest Soviet Union. The 1932 harvest had been a poor one and had followed several years of lower productivity. Stalin blamed the famine on hostile peasants, and the government provided small amounts of food to famine-struck rural areas, although, as you can expect, this wasn't nearly enough to stop starvation. In 1935 to 1936, Stalin oversaw a new constitution which was very liberal. However, this was only used as propaganda since Stalin and his Politburo had all power. He declared that socialism, which is the first phase of communism, had basically been achieved in this country. In 1938, the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, was written, which is totally not propaganda. Now, a number of authorized Stalin biographies were also published, although Stalin generally wanted to be portrayed as the embodiment of the Communist Party rather than having his life explored. During the late 1930s, Stalin placed a few limits on the worship of his own greatness. so humble. By 1938, Stalin's inner circle had gained a degree of stability, containing the personalities who would remain there until his death. And that's it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.